November 18th, 1955. King Washington owned every corner of Chicago's South Side. Every politician, every cop, every judge. But tonight, he wanted something money couldn't buy: Winston Churchill's dignity. The majestic theater was packed with 800 people. Washington had paid for every seat. His plan was simple: interrupt Churchill's speech, drag him into a public debate about Britain's role in Africa, and watch the old bulldog crumble. Marcus Whitfield stood in the wings, watching Washington's men position themselves throughout the crowd. The crime boss didn't know that Whitfield had served under Churchill in Burma, didn't know about the bodies, the secrets, the debt that would never be paid. Washington raised his hand to signal his men. Churchill stepped to the podium, and Marcus realized this wasn't about humiliation at all. This was an execution. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Washington's signal rippled through the theater like a stone dropped in dark water. 3 men in the front row shifted forward, 2 more near the exit doors. Marcus counted at least 6 positions, probably more he couldn't see. The crime boss had planned this with military precision, which meant someone had given him intelligence, someone who knew how Churchill operated. The old prime minister began his speech about the special relationship between Britain and America, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly authority that had rallied a nation during the Blitz. The audience, Washington's audience, listened with polite attention, waiting for their cue to turn into a mob. Marcus stepped deeper into the wings, his mind racing through possibilities. He could fire a warning shot, create chaos that might give Churchill a chance to escape. He could trigger the theater's ancient fire alarm system, force an evacuation. But Washington had positioned men at every exit. Churchill would never make it to his car. A flash of movement in the balcony caught his eye. A woman with auburn hair partially hidden in shadow. Something familiar about the way she held herself, the angle of her head as she surveyed the scene below. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Sarah Kellerman, Me-6's best operative. The woman who'd shared his bed in a Rangoon safe house while they planned the mission that damned them both. She was supposed to be dead. He'd seen the intelligence report himself, filed 3 years ago after a botched operation in Prague. But there she was, very much alive, watching Churchill with the same predatory focus that Marcus remembered from Burma, which meant British intelligence knew about Washington's plan. They'd let Churchill walk into this trap. The realization hit him like shrapnel. They wanted this to happen. Churchill's voice rose as he spoke about democracy's triumph over tyranny, about the bonds forged in war. Standard diplomatic rhetoric, but Marcus heard something else underneath, a subtle emphasis on certain words, a rhythm that matched the old wartime codes. The Prime Minister was sending a message. Washington stood up in the 3rd row, his massive frame commanding attention even before he spoke. The crime boss was dressed like a businessman, but the scars on his knuckles and the predatory gleam in his eyes marked him as something far more dangerous. Mr. Churchill, Washington's voice boomed across the theater, cutting through the speech like a blade. You talk about democracy, but what about the villages you burned in Kenya? What about the concentration camps you built in South Africa? The audience stirred, exactly as planned. Washington had done his homework, chosen accusations that would resonate with an African-American audience that remembered how Britain had carved up the continent. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Churchill paused, his pale eyes scanning the theater with the calculation of a man who'd survived 40 years of political warfare. When he smiled, Marcus recognized the expression, the same cold amusement Churchill had shown in Burma when Marcus reported that the village had been pacified. Mr. Washington, Churchill said, his voice carrying clearly without the microphone. I wondered when you might make your appearance. The crime boss's confidence flickered for just a moment. He hadn't expected Churchill to know his name, to treat this interruption like a scheduled appointment rather than an ambush. Marcus saw Sarah lean forward in the balcony, her attention laser-focused on the exchange. Whatever was happening here, she was recording every word, every gesture. This wasn't about stopping Washington's plan. It was about letting it play out while gathering intelligence. You came here to humiliate me, Churchill continued, stepping around the podium like a teacher addressing a slow student, to drag me into a debate about empire, about the difficult choices made in difficult times. but I suspect you've been misinformed about who holds the upper hand in this theater tonight." Washington's men began moving, closing the trap they'd spent weeks preparing. But Churchill showed no fear, no concern about the armed killers surrounding him. If anything, he seemed energized by the confrontation. "You see, Mr. Washington, I didn't come to Chicago to give speeches about democracy. I came to collect a debt, one that's been outstanding for exactly 10 years, 3 months, and 14 days. Marcus felt the words hit him like a physical blow. 10 years, 3 months, 14 days, the exact time since Burma, since the village, since he'd followed Churchill's orders and crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Sarah was looking directly at him now, her green eyes visible even across the theater's shadows. She raised one hand to her throat, an old signal from their operational days. Abort. Extract. Run. But Marcus understood the truth now. There would be no running from this. Churchill had orchestrated everything: Washington's plan, Sarah's presence, even Marcus's own position in this theater. The Prime Minister had spent a decade setting up this moment. The execution Washington planned wasn't meant for Churchill. It was meant for Marcus. 10 years, 3 months, 14 days. The precision was no coincidence. Churchill remembered the exact date Marcus had torched the village outside Mandalay, following orders that came with the Prime Minister's personal seal. Women and children screaming in languages Marcus didn't understand while he stood frozen, watching the flames consume evidence that could have toppled governments. The scent of Sarah's perfumed jasmine and gunpowder, exactly as he remembered, drifted down from the balcony like a ghost's caress. She'd worn it in that Rangoon safe house when they'd planned the Burma operation, when she'd traced the scars on his chest with fingers that could disarm a man or snap his neck with equal grace. He'd thought her dead for 3 years, had even placed white roses on an empty grave in Highgate Cemetery during his last visit to London. But there she was, watching him with those green eyes that had once looked at him with something approaching love. Before Burma, before he'd chosen Churchill's orders over her protests, before he'd learned that loyalty was just another word for cowardice. Washington's men continued their careful positioning, but Marcus barely noticed them now. His mind was racing backward, 15 years into the past, when he'd first bought this crumbling theater with his discharge pay and the guilt money Churchill had quietly transferred to his account. The Avalon had become his sanctuary, his penance, a place where he could disappear into the honest struggles of keeping an aging building alive in a neighborhood that remembered him only as the strange British man who paid his bills on time and never caused trouble. Mrs. Delilah Washington, no relation to Vincent, despite the shared name, emerged from the lobby's shadows, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with the protective instincts of a mother watching over her children. She'd become his anchor these past 15 years, the closest thing to family he'd allowed himself. At 73, she moved with the measured dignity of someone who'd survived the Great Migration, 2 wars, and the kind of everyday violence that never made headlines. "Mr. Marcus," she whispered, appearing at his elbow with the silent grace that had made her invaluable during neighborhood disputes and late-night emergencies. "Something ain't right about this. These men, they've been watching you all week, not Mr. Churchill you." Her weathered hand touched his arm, and Marcus felt the tremor in her fingers. Delilah had survived too much to be easily frightened, but tonight had pushed her past some invisible threshold. She'd noticed what he'd been too distracted to see: the surveillance, the careful preparation, the way Washington's men had studied the theater's layout like they were planning a military operation. "Get to the basement," Marcus murmured, never taking his eyes off the stage where Churchill and Washington faced each other like circling predators. "Use the service tunnel to Monroe Street. Don't come back until morning. I ain't leaving you. Delilah." The sharpness in his voice surprised them both. He forced himself to soften it, knowing this might be the last conversation they ever had. "Please, trust me one more time." She squeezed his arm once, a gesture that carried 15 years of shared struggles: late rent payments, broken heating systems, neighborhood kids who'd found refuge in the theater's dusty rehearsal rooms. Then she melted back into the shadows, taking with her the only pure thing Marcus had managed to protect since the war. On stage, Churchill's voice rose with theatrical precision, The debt I mentioned, Mr. Washington, isn't financial, it's moral, a matter of justice long delayed. His pale eyes swept the wings until they found Marcus, and the old man's smile carried the weight of empires. Justice for those who trusted the wrong people, who believed that following orders absolved them of consequence. Sarah's position in the balcony shifted slightly, her hand moving to the small of her back where Marcus knew she kept a ceramic knife that could slice through muscle like butter. She was preparing for violence, but her target remained unclear. Was she here to protect Churchill, to eliminate Marcus, or was she playing some deeper game, one that dated back to those sweat-soaked nights in Burma when they'd shared intelligence and secrets, and something that might have been love? The audience began to stir with genuine unease now, sensing that the confrontation had moved beyond political theater into something far more personal and dangerous. Marcus caught glimpses of faces he recognized: local shop owners, teachers from the elementary school, members of the church choir who'd performed on this very stage last Christmas. His throat tightened. These were the people he'd chosen over his old life, the community that had accepted him despite never quite understanding him. Now Churchill's long reach had found him, transforming innocent neighbors into potential casualties of a war that should have ended in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The trap was closing, and everyone Marcus had learned to love was caught inside it. "This came for you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over Churchill's continuing speech, hand-delivered not 5 minutes ago by a man who knew exactly where to find you in this maze of a building. Marcus stared at the envelope without taking it, his blood turning to Arctic slush. The wax seal was unbroken, deep crimson against ivory paper that cost more than most of his neighbors made in a week. But it wasn't the luxury that paralyzed him. It was the handwriting, elegant script that belonged to a dead man. Colonel Marcus Whitfield, theater director, the Avalon Playhouse, Chicago Personal and Confidential. The handwriting belonged to Captain Jonathan Hartwell, Marcus's second-in-command in Burma, the man who'd questioned the village operation from the beginning, who tried to convince Marcus to disobey Churchill's orders. The man Marcus had watched die in a Rangoon hospital bed, his body ravaged by infected shrapnel wounds, his final words a whispered plea for forgiveness that Marcus had never been able to grant himself. "That's impossible," Marcus breathed, but his fingers were already breaking the seal with mechanical precision, muscle memory overriding rational thought. Inside, a single sheet of Foreign Office letterhead contained 3 paragraphs in that familiar, impossible script. "Marcus, if you're reading this, Churchill's endgame has begun. I know you think I died in Rangoon. You were meant to think that. My 6 had other plans, just as they had other plans for Sarah, for you, for everyone who witnessed what happened in that village. The children didn't die, Marcus. We saved them. But Churchill couldn't let you know that, couldn't risk your conscience interfering with what came next. You've spent 15 years believing you're a war criminal, but you were never the target of this operation. You were the bait. Find the red ledger hidden in your office safe, behind the false back panel. Read it before they come for you. And Marcus, Sarah never betrayed you. We betrayed each other. Your friend in shadows." The letter slipped from Marcus's nerveless fingers, drifting to the floor like a white flag of surrender. The world tilted on its axis, 15 years of carefully constructed guilt crashing down like a demolition charge detonating in his chest. The children's faces that haunted his dreams, the little girl with braided hair, the boy who couldn't have been more than 8, they'd lived. They'd escaped the flames that existed only in his nightmares, manufactured by Churchill's psychological warfare experts to keep him compliant, isolated, perfectly positioned for this moment. Delilah's hand gripped his shoulder, anchoring him as his knees threatened to buckle. "Mr. Marcus, you're scaring me. What's that letter say?" But Marcus was already moving, his body operating on autopilot while his mind reeled from the revelation. He pushed through the dusty corridors behind the stage, past storage rooms filled with moldering costumes and broken spotlights, toward the cramped office where he'd spent countless nights balancing books and pretending he was just another theater owner struggling to keep the lights on. The safe squatted in the corner like a black toad, its combination lock worn smooth by 15 years of routine. Marcus's fingers spun the dial. His mother's birthday, then Sarah's, Then the date he'd first kissed her in that Rangoon safe house when the world still made sense. The mechanism clicked open with mechanical indifference. Behind stacks of insurance papers and bank statements, his fingers found the false panel Hartwell had mentioned. It gave way with a soft click, revealing a slim red ledger that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. The first page made his blood freeze. Operation Palladium. Classified eyes only. Primary objective. Establish deep cover asset in American criminal underground. Secondary objective. Maintain psychological control through manufactured. Gil Tacit. Colonel Marcus Whitfield. Handler. Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Personal oversight. Page after page detailed 15 years of manipulation. How Churchill's people had guided Marcus to Chicago, steered him toward the Avalon, ensured that Vincent Washington would eventually notice the British theater owner in his territory. How they'd cultivated his guilt about Burma, feeding him false intelligence reports about civilian casualties that never existed. How they'd staged Sarah's death in Prague to sever his last emotional connection to his old life. And finally, the real purpose. Marcus wasn't the target of tonight's operation. He was the weapon. Washington's planned humiliation of Churchill was meant to trigger Marcus's protective instincts, force him to choose between his new community and his old loyalties. In that choice, Churchill would finally have the leverage he needed to crack Washington's organization from within. The ledger fell from Marcus's hands as Sarah's voice drifted down from the office doorway, soft as smoke and sharp as winter. "Hello, Marcus. We need to talk. That's not how I wanted to start," Sarah said conversationally, stepping into the office with the fluid grace of a predator. She wore the same black dress from the balcony, but now Marcus could see the tactical modifications, reinforced seams, hidden pockets, fabric that wouldn't tear during close combat. "But then, you always were too clever for your own good. You're supposed to be dead." Marcus pressed himself against the desk's solid oak, his mind racing through escape routes that didn't exist. The office had one door, one window that faced a 3-story drop, and Sarah standing between him and both. Dead, missing, deep cover. The classifications blur together after a while. Her footsteps moved closer, deliberate and unhurried. "Did you really think Churchill would let his most effective operative simply retire to run a theater? You killed 17 enemy agents in Burma alone. That's not the kind of talent one discards." Through the office's thin walls, Marcus could hear the confrontation on stage escalating. Washington's voice no longer controlled. "You think you can come into my territory and threaten me, old man?" A scraping sound, chairs being overturned, the audience beginning to panic. "Hartwell's letter," Marcus said, buying time while his fingers searched the desk's bottom drawer for the emergency Webley he'd hidden there. "The children survived. You knew." Sarah's laugh held no warmth. "Jonathan always was sentimental. Yes, we saved the children. But not out of compassion. They were excellent intelligence assets once properly trained. That little girl with the braids? She's eliminated 3 communist cell leaders in Singapore over the past decade." Marcus's blood turned to ice water. Even the redemption had been a lie. The children's salvation just another layer of manipulation in Churchill's infinite chess game. "The guilt served its purpose," Sarah continued. "Kept you isolated, manageable, exactly where we needed you. Vincent Washington has been watching this theater for 2 years, Marcus. Watching you. Churchill made sure of that." A crash from the stage shook the building's frame, something heavy hitting wood, possibly a body. The audience's murmur had become frightened shouting, but no one was leaving. Washington's men would have sealed the exits by now, trapping everyone inside Churchill's carefully orchestrated theater of operations. Marcus's fingers found the Webley's grip, but as he started to draw it, Sarah's voice froze him. "Mrs. Delilah Washington is in the basement, isn't she? Lovely woman. Hartwell's quite fond of her. They've been corresponding for months about the theater's financial records." The implication hit Marcus like a physical blow. Delilah, who'd become his anchor, his one pure connection to an honest life, she'd been reporting to British intelligence all along. The motherly concern, the shared struggles, the way she'd always known exactly what he needed to hear, all of it performance, as carefully scripted as anything on the Avalon's stage. "You bastards," Marcus whispered. "We're pragmatists," Sarah corrected. Churchill needed an asset inside Washington's organization, someone with the right background, the right skills, the right psychological profile, to be turned when the moment came. You've been preparing for this role for 15 years without realizing it. From the stage came the distinctive crack of Washington's Colt. 45, followed by screaming. But beneath it, Marcus heard something that chilled him more than gunfire. Churchill's laughter, rich and genuinely amused, as if violence had been exactly what he'd expected. "He's not in danger, is he?" Marcus said, understanding flooding through him like nausea. "Washington's not trying to kill Churchill. This whole confrontation is Winston's retirement party," Sarah finished. "His final operation before stepping down as Prime Minister. He wanted to end his career by cleaning up loose ends, and you represent his loosest end of all. The only living witness to what really happened in Burma." Marcus's hand tightened on the Webley, but he couldn't bring himself to draw it. Not on Sarah, despite everything. Not on the woman who'd shared his bed in Rangoon, who'd taught him that love and betrayal were often indistinguishable. "Vincent Washington dies tonight," Sarah said softly. "Along with his top lieutenants. The Chicago syndicate collapses and MI6 claims credit for dismantling a major criminal organization. Very tidy. And me?" Sarah's green eyes held something that might have been regret. "You were always going to be collateral damage, Marcus. The only question was whether you'd die as a hero or a coward." Outside the office, the theater had gone ominously quiet. No more shouting, no more gunfire, just the kind of silence that followed slaughter. "They're all dead, aren't they?" Marcus asked. "The neighbors, the people who trusted me." Sarah didn't answer, but her expression confirmed his worst fears. The trap had closed, and everyone Marcus had learned to love was gone. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly. "Something Hartwell's letter didn't tell you." Marcus closed his eyes, bracing for another revelation that would shatter what remained of his understanding. 15 years of guilt had been stripped away in minutes, replaced by the far worse knowledge that every choice he'd made since Burma had been choreographed by Churchill's invisible hand. "The village operation," Sarah continued. "The reason we were really there, it wasn't about protecting supply lines or gathering intelligence on Japanese troop movements." "Stop!" Marcus's voice cracked like a whip. "I don't want to know, but you do. You've spent 15 years wondering why Churchill personally ordered that mission, why a future prime minister would micromanage a small tactical operation in the middle of nowhere." Outside the office, footsteps echoed through the theater corridor's heavy boots, moving with military precision. Churchill's cleanup crew, most likely. The kind of men who specialized in making problems disappear without leaving inconvenient evidence behind. Sarah stepped closer, her silenced Mauser now hanging loose at her side. The village wasn't harboring Japanese sympathizers, Marcus. They were hiding something else entirely. Documents that could have ended Churchill's political career before it truly began. Marcus forced himself to look at her. This woman who'd taught him that intimacy and betrayal were merely different faces of the same coin. Her green eyes held shadows he'd never seen before, depths of regret that matched his own. What documents? Correspondence between Churchill and certain German industrialists. Pre-war agreements about post-war reconstruction contracts. Nothing treasonous, technically, but enough to destroy his reputation if revealed at the wrong moment. The villagers had acquired them through the black market, planned to sell them to the highest bidder. The office felt like a tomb, airless and cold despite the Chicago heat. Marcus understood now why Churchill had insisted on personal oversight, why the operation had required such surgical precision. They hadn't been soldiers that night. They'd been burglars, stealing back secrets that could topple governments. "The children," Marcus said hoarsely. "They saw the documents. They couldn't read them. But they'd seen the faces of the men who'd hidden them, heard enough conversations to become dangerous witnesses. Churchill couldn't risk loose ends. So you saved them to control them." Sarah nodded slowly. "Hartwell suggested elimination. I proposed recruitment. Children are remarkably adaptable when properly motivated." The footsteps in the corridor had stopped just outside the office door. Marcus counted at least 3 sets of boots, probably more. Professional killers who'd been waiting 15 years for this moment, when Churchill's longest-running operation would finally reach its conclusion. "There's something else you should know," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "About tonight. About why Churchill really came to Chicago." Marcus's finger tightened on the Webley's trigger, Each revelation cut deeper than the last, slicing away layers of illusion until only raw truth remained. He'd thought himself a war criminal seeking redemption through community service. Then he'd learned he was an unwitting intelligence asset. Now Sarah was preparing to tell him something worse, something that would explain why Churchill had orchestrated this elaborate finale. Vincent Washington has been blackmailing British officials for 3 years, Sarah said. Someone's been feeding him classified information about MI6 operations in the Americas. Churchill knows there's a mole in the Foreign Office, but he can't root them out through conventional means. So he's using me as bait, not just bait. When Washington dies tonight, his files will be searched. The mole's identity will be exposed, along with a dozen other security breaches. Churchill gets to clean house one final time before stepping down. Marcus felt the weight of 15 years pressing down on him like water at crushing depth. Every friendship he'd formed in Chicago, every small kindness he'd shown to neighborhood children, every quiet evening spent reading in his cramped apartment, all of it had been preparation for this moment. Churchill had shaped his entire post-war existence to create the perfect weapon for tonight's operation. The theater, Marcus said, understanding flooding through him. All those years of financial struggles, barely making rent, you kept it failing on purpose. A successful theater owner wouldn't have attracted Washington's attention. But a struggling British expatriate with mysterious funding sources, that suggested vulnerability, secrets worth exploiting. The doorknob turned with mechanical precision. Sarah raised her weapon smoothly, but Marcus realized with sickening clarity that she wasn't aiming at the door. The Mauser's barrel pointed directly at his chest, steady as a surgeon's hand. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she whispered. "But Churchill was right about one thing. You've always been too dangerous to leave alive." Outside the office, someone began counting down from 10 in Churchill's unmistakable voice. When he reached 0, the real killing would begin. "Sarah," he said quietly, the Webley still hidden behind the desk, "turn around." She didn't move, didn't even blink. The Mauser remained trained on his chest with mechanical precision. 6. Turn around and look at what your precious Churchill is doing to innocent people. 5. They're not innocent, Marcus. Washington's entire organization. Delilah Washington is 63 years old. Marcus's voice cracked like a whip. She makes tea for the neighborhood children and worries about my eating habits. What possible threat could she pose to British intelligence? 4. For the first time since entering the office, Sarah's composure flickered. The Mauser's barrel wavered almost imperceptibly, and Marcus saw something he'd forgotten existed in her green eyes' doubt. 3. The old woman was never part of the syndicate, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You know it, I know it, Churchill knows it, but she's down there anyway, isn't she? Waiting for your people to put a bullet in her head because she happened to work at the wrong theater. 2. Marcus, you don't understand the bigger picture. The bigger picture? Marcus stood slowly, the Webley now visible but not yet raised. 15 years ago, you convinced me that sacrificing innocence was necessary to protect Churchill's reputation. Tonight, you're asking me to believe it again. But here's what I finally understand, Sarah. There is no bigger picture. There's just an old man's pride and the people he's willing to murder to protect it. 1-0. The explosion came from the theater's basement, followed immediately by automatic gunfire. Not the clean, surgical elimination Sarah had implied, but a full-scale massacre. Marcus could hear Churchill's voice through the floorboards, no longer counting but shouting orders with the enthusiasm of a man who'd found his true calling in orchestrated violence. Sarah's face had gone pale. That's not... We were supposed to extract the intelligence first, then what? Give them a sporting chance? Marcus raised the Webley slowly, deliberately. How many more operations have there been, Sarah? How many other Marcus Whitfields scattered across how many other cities, living lives you've carefully constructed for them, waiting for the day Churchill decides they've outlived their usefulness? The gunfire below had stopped. In the sudden silence, Marcus could hear individual voices, Churchill giving quiet instructions, someone weeping softly, the distinctive click of ammunition being reloaded. Professional sounds that spoke of long experience with this kind of work. You want to know the real revelation? Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos. It's not that Churchill manipulated me for 15 years. It's not that you faked your death or turned children into assassins or made me believe I was a war criminal." Sarah's finger tightened on the Mauser's trigger, but her eyes remained locked on his face. "The real revelation is that I've spent all this time thinking I was the victim of your operation. But I'm not, am I? I never was." Understanding dawned in Sarah's expression like sunrise breaking over a battlefield, beautiful, terrible, and far too late. "I'm the contingency plan," Marcus continued. "The expendable asset you activate when the primary operation goes wrong. Churchill didn't come to Chicago to clean up loose ends. He came because something broke in London. Something big enough to require burning down his entire American network." Sarah's weapon hand began to tremble almost imperceptibly. "There is no mole in the Foreign Office feeding information to Washington," Marcus said with quiet certainty. "The mole is you, Sarah. It's always been you." And Churchill finally figured it out. The Mauser's barrel dropped 6 inches before Sarah caught herself, but it was too late. Marcus had seen the truth written across her face in letters of fire, guilt, resignation, and beneath it all, the terrible relief of a woman who'd been carrying an unbearable secret for too long. "How long?" he asked softly. "Since Prague," she whispered. "Since they told me to fake my own death. I realized then that Churchill would sacrifice anyone, manipulate anyone, betray anyone to protect his legacy. So I started feeding information to people who could stop him. Washington was your asset. Washington was supposed to be a way to funnel Churchill's worst secrets to the Americans, let them handle the cleanup. But the old bastard was too clever. He turned my own network against me." From downstairs came the sound of heavy boots on wooden stairs. Churchill's people, finished with their work, coming to complete the final phase of the operation. In minutes they would find 2 British agents dead in a Chicago theater office, apparent casualties of a criminal syndicate that had been thoroughly eliminated. Clean, surgical, deniable. Marcus looked at the woman he'd loved, lost, and now finally understood. "Sarah," he said gently, "we're not getting out of this alive, are we?" Her smile held all the sadness of 15 wasted years. "Not even close." "There's a service tunnel," Sarah whispered suddenly, her eyes darting toward a narrow door Marcus had always assumed was a closet, behind the filing cabinet. "It connects to the old speakeasy next door." Marcus didn't move. "Why tell me now?" "Because in 30 seconds, Churchill's men are going to kick down that door expecting to find my body and yours. When they don't, they'll tear this building apart board by board until they do." The sound of whispered consultation filtered through the door. Someone was picking the lock with professional efficiency, no dramatic shoulder charges, just methodical work that spoke of long experience with locked rooms and the secrets they contained. "The tunnel leads to Washington's real operation," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "Not the street-level syndicate Churchill just eliminated. The actual intelligence network Vincent's been running for the past 5 years." Marcus felt the last piece of the puzzle slide into place with almost audible finality. Washington wasn't just your asset. He was playing you both. The man's a genius. Former Army intelligence, recruited by the OSS during the war. When they disbanded, he didn't retire, he went freelance. Built a criminal organization as cover for the most sophisticated intelligence operation in the Midwest. The lock mechanism gave a soft click. Marcus could hear someone testing the doorknob with infinite patience. "Churchill thought he was using Washington to flush me out," Sarah whispered. "I thought I was using Washington to expose Churchill's crimes. But Vincent was using both of us to map the entire structure of British intelligence operations in North America." Marcus glanced at the narrow door behind the filing cabinet. Escape was possible, but only for one of them. The tunnel would be barely wide enough for a single person, and whoever went second would be trapped when Churchill's men breached the office. "How do I know you're not lying?" Marcus asked. 15 years of deception, and now you want me to trust you with my life?" Sarah's smile held genuine warmth for the first time since she'd entered the office. "Because, my dear Marcus, I just told you the one secret that could get us both killed even if we escape. Churchill doesn't know about Washington's real operation. If Vincent survives tonight, he'll have everything he needs to destroy British intelligence from the inside out." The doorknob turned slowly, silently. "And if I go through that tunnel, You find Vincent Washington very much alive, very well armed, and very interested in what you know about tonight's operation. He's been waiting for this moment, when Churchill would finally overplay his hand and give Vincent the evidence he needs. Marcus understood then why Sarah had chosen this moment for her confession. Not mercy, not love, not even guilt, but calculation. She was offering him a chance to become the weapon that would finally destroy Winston Churchill's legacy. "The children from Burma," Marcus said quietly. "The ones you turned into assassins. Where are they now?" Sarah's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Safe, hidden. Vincent's been extracting them one by one over the past 3 years. They think they're working for British intelligence, but every mission has been designed to gather evidence of Churchill's crimes." The door began to open with infinite slowness. Marcus could see a sliver of corridor light, the edge of a boot, the barrel of what looked like a Thompson submachine gun. "Go," Sarah whispered, raising her Mauser toward the door. "Find Vincent. Tell him the code phrase, Rangoon Christmas. He'll know you're from me." Marcus hesitated, the Webley heavy in his hand. 15 years ago he'd left Sarah for dead in a Prague alley. Tonight she was asking him to do it again. "What about you? I'm going to give you the head start you need." Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, her aim now fixed on the slowly opening door. "And I'm going to settle an old debt with Winston Bloody Churchill." Marcus moved toward the filing cabinet, then stopped. "Sarah, in Rangoon, that last night before everything went to hell." She glanced back at him, her green eyes bright with something that might have been tears. "It was real," she said simply. "Everything else was performance, but that night was real." The door burst open as Marcus slipped into the tunnel, Sarah's Mauser chattering behind him like deadly punctuation. He crawled through absolute darkness toward Vincent Washington's truth, leaving behind the last remnant of the man he'd been. Behind him, Churchill's voice rose in genuine surprise for the first time all evening. The game, it seemed, was far from over. The tunnel ended in a basement that smelled of gun oil and old money. Marcus emerged from the cramped passage into a room that defied every assumption he'd held about Vincent Washington's operation. Instead of the crude criminal headquarters he'd expected, he found himself in what appeared to be a sophisticated intelligence center radio equipment, humming quietly along one wall, filing cabinets arranged with military precision, and maps of Chicago marked with colored pins that suggested surveillance operations spanning years. Vincent Washington sat behind a mahogany desk that belonged in a Whitehall office, wearing a perfectly pressed navy suit that emphasized his imposing frame. He looked up from a leather-bound folder as Marcus stumbled into the light, his dark eyes showing no surprise at the appearance of a disheveled British theater owner with a gun in his hand. "Colonel Marcus Whitfield," Vincent said in a voice like aged whiskey, smooth and dangerous. "Right on time. Though I confess I expected you to arrive through the front door rather than Sarah's escape route." Marcus kept the Webley raised but didn't point it directly at Washington. The sounds of gunfire from the theater had stopped, leaving only the distant rumble of Chicago traffic and the mechanical hum of intelligence equipment. "Rangoon Christmas," Marcus said. Vincent's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something that might have been respect. "Sarah Kellerman, is she dead?" "She will be soon. Churchill's men are cleaning house. Then we'd better make this conversation count." Vincent gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. "Please, Colonel. You've been standing at attention for 15 years. It's time to sit down." Marcus remained standing but lowered the Webley slightly. "Sarah told me about your real operation, about the children from Burma, about the intelligence you've been gathering on Churchill. Sarah told you what she thought would get you through that tunnel alive." Vincent opened the leather folder, revealing photographs that made Marcus's blood turn to ice water. Images of himself from the past 15 years teaching neighborhood children to read, arguing with landlords about theater repairs, sharing quiet dinners with elderly Mrs. Washington. An entire life documented with surveillance precision. "The truth, Colonel, is considerably more complex." Vincent turned the folder toward Marcus. The final photograph showed Churchill himself, standing in the shadow of the theater's back alley not 3 hours ago, speaking intently with a figure whose face was obscured by darkness. "Do you recognize the second man in that picture?" Vincent asked quietly. Marcus leaned forward, studying the image with growing horror. The figure's posture was familiar, the set of his shoulders, the way he held his left hand slightly raised, a habit Marcus had developed after taking shrapnel in Korea. "That's impossible. You've been working for Churchill all along," Vincent said with gentle finality. "Not as an unwitting asset or a manipulated pawn, but as a willing collaborator. The Marcus Whitfield who lived in this neighborhood, who struggled to keep a failing theater alive, who formed genuine friendships with working-class families. That man was real, but he was also reporting everything he learned to British intelligence." The folder contained more photographs, documents in Marcus's own handwriting, correspondence bearing his signature. 15 years of intelligence reports, filed with methodical precision, detailing the lives and vulnerabilities of everyone in the South Side community he'd claimed to love. "The children," Marcus whispered, remembering young Tommy Henderson, who'd trusted him enough to share stories about his father's work at the steel mill. Information that had appeared, almost word for word, in one of the reports. "All of them," Vincent confirmed. "Every family that took you in, every neighbor who invited you for Sunday dinner, every person who treated you as something more than a failed British officer hiding from his past. You cataloged their secrets, their fears, their weaknesses, and you sent those reports to London every month without fail." Marcus's hands began to shake. The Webley felt impossibly heavy, like a weapon forged from guilt and weighted with betrayal. "But you don't remember any of it, do you?" Vincent's voice held unexpected compassion. "Because that's the truly ingenious part of Churchill's operation. He didn't just manipulate your circumstances, he manipulated your memories. Careful psychological conditioning, probably started in those military hospitals after Korea. They made you forget your own complicity." The room seemed to tilt around Marcus like the deck of a sinking ship. 15 years of carefully constructed identity crumbled in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He wasn't a war criminal seeking redemption. He was an active intelligence asset who'd been psychologically programmed to forget his own betrayals. "The mission in Burma," Marcus said desperately. "Sarah, the children, all true. But you weren't traumatized by what you'd done, Colonel. You were traumatized by what Churchill planned to make you do next. So they buried those memories, gave you a new identity, and sent you to Chicago to begin the longest intelligence operation in MI6 history." Vincent closed the folder with quiet finality. "Welcome back to consciousness, Colonel Whitfield. Winston Churchill is waiting upstairs to collect his most successful weapon." "Sarah?" Marcus asked, though he already knew. "Dead, along with Churchill's cleanup crew." Vincent's voice carried neither satisfaction nor regret. "The old man's upstairs now, waiting for his star pupil to emerge from the basement and receive his commendation." Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Commendation? For what? 15 years of spying on families who invited me to their dinner tables? For proving that the British Empire's greatest weapon isn't military might or economic leverage, it's the ability to make good men forget they've become monsters." Vincent stood, moving to a wall safe hidden behind a false panel. "Churchill's been refining the process since the war ended. Psychological conditioning that creates perfect assets who genuinely believe in their cover identities." From the safe, Vincent withdrew a single envelope sealed with red wax. "Your real mission briefing, Colonel. The one they gave you before they buried your memories." Sarah managed to steal it from MI6 files before she went underground. Marcus stared at the envelope as if it contained a live serpent. The wax seal bore Churchill's personal signet ring, the same symbol that had graced orders sending men to their deaths across 2 world wars. "I don't want to know. You need to know." Vincent's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Because in 5 minutes you're going to walk upstairs and face the man who turned you into his instrument, and you'll need to decide whether you want to remain his weapon or become mine." The envelope felt weightless and impossibly heavy simultaneously. Marcus broke the seal with fingers that belonged to a stranger, unfolding pages written in his own handwriting, reports he didn't remember writing, observations about neighbors he genuinely loved, tactical assessments of community leaders he'd considered friends. The final page was different, a mission summary in Churchill's distinctive script outlining Phase 2 of Operation Prometheus, the systematic recruitment of assets from within the South Side community, leveraging the trust Marcus had built to turn ordinary Americans into unwitting intelligence sources. "Mrs. Washington," Marcus whispered, recognizing the elderly woman's name on the target list. Tommy Henderson, the Kowalski family, everyone who had shown him kindness, scheduled for psychological manipulation and recruitment. All of them, Vincent confirmed. Churchill's planned to build a network of American assets who would never know they were working for British intelligence. Community leaders, union organizers, steel workers with access to industrial secrets, an entire neighborhood turned into unwitting spies. Marcus understood then why his memories had been suppressed, not to protect him from guilt over past crimes, but to prevent him from sabotaging future operations through misplaced sentiment. "How long have you known?" Marcus asked. "Since the day you arrived." "Sarah had already made contact with me, warned me that Churchill was placing an asset in the community. We've been watching you, protecting the neighborhood from your own mission without you realizing it." The irony was exquisite. For 15 years, Marcus had believed himself a failed intelligence officer seeking redemption through community service. In reality, he'd been an active spy whose mission was being quietly sabotaged by the very people he was targeting. "Sarah could have exposed me at any time. She wanted to save you. Believed that, somewhere beneath the conditioning, was the man she'd loved in Rangoon, someone worth rescuing." Vincent moved to the radio equipment, beginning to adjust frequencies with practiced efficiency. She spent 3 years building a network to extract Churchill's programmed assets, trying to deprogram them, help them remember who they'd been. Static filled the room as Vincent found his frequency. Within moments, voices began reporting in Sarah's network, confirming the elimination of Churchill's team, the securing of intelligence materials, the beginning of cleanup operations that would erase all evidence of the night's events. The children from Burma, safe, hidden in plain sight across a dozen American cities, living normal lives under new identities. Sarah's greatest achievement, turning Churchill's assassins into ordinary people capable of love, friendship, hope. Marcus thought of Tommy Henderson teaching him to play stickball, of Mrs. Washington's Sunday dinners, of the countless small kindnesses that had made 15 years of exile feel like redemption. All of it real, despite the lies that had brought him here. Above them, floorboards creaked as Churchill moved through the theater, perhaps wondering why his weapon hadn't yet reported for duty. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. Vincent handed him a thick manila envelope. Inside were identity documents, travel papers, and a bank draft sufficient to start over anywhere in the world. "Churchill dies tonight. A heart attack. Very tragic. Very believable. His network dies with him. You can disappear, become whoever you choose to be." Marcus looked at the papers that promised freedom, then at the Webley that represented 15 years of unconscious servitude. Or you go upstairs and face the man who stole your life. Your choice, Colonel." Outside, Chicago's night winds carried the scent of snow and the distant promise of dawn.